In the 1970s and 80s, Massachusetts was a dangerous place. Organized crime ran the underworld, and independent robbery crews operated throughout the Commonwealth. Local police departments were incredibly corrupt, even the Mass State Police, the MDC Metropolitan Police, and yes, the FBI. Gloucester, Massachusetts was no different, which at one time was the largest fishing port in the country and the oldest seaport in America. It had its fair share of legendary crews. Out of the wide open waterfront and the streets of this port city, one name rang louder than the rest: George Skippy Cream, which to this day is one of Fish City's most enduring legends. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. I have an incredible story for you guys today from the wild old days of Gloucester's past. This is one of the most enduring legends on the island and is believed by many people to have been swept under the rug by the local authorities. The legend of George Cream III, aka Skippy Cream, is one that I heard through the majority of my childhood and brings back memories of Gloucester's olden days. In the 1970s and 80s, even most of the 1990s, Gloucester was a rough little fishing port city. The tough blue-collar fishing industry mentality had been fostered in the city for centuries at this point, with generation after generation working in some capacity for the fishing fleet. But by the late 1960s, the city of Gloucester was becoming a port for something else entirely. This has always been part of Gloucester's legend and its mystique, that during this time period, the city was one of the biggest H ports in the entire country. Regardless of how it happened, the city of Gloucester had a deeply entrenched subculture that centered around narcotics well before it was all over the rest of the country. Out of this subculture, many legendary names rang bells in the city: dealers, hustlers, traffickers, bank robbers, and just in general tough guys. One name always rang just a little bit louder than the rest though, and that was George Skippy Cream. A big reason for the endurance of Skippy's legend is because of his tragic and untimely demise, but I think the tale continues because of the fact of who the man really was. A lot of you guys have asked for videos about Gloucester where I live. Many older people from Massachusetts know about the city's reputation in the past. That's why I get a little amused when people clown on Gloucester in the comments. Now it's totally different, but back when I was a kid, Gloucester was a tough little city. Because of its natural beauty, tons of people with money have moved here, and in the last 10 years, the city has completely changed. But in the 1970s and 80s, it wasn't like that. The actual city of Gloucester, the downtown area, was dingy and run down. As soon as you hit the stoplights at the end of the 128 extension, all you could smell was fish, and not in a pleasant way. Rogers Street and Main Street were lined with dive bar after dive bar for thirsty fishermen. Now there's only two left in the whole city. They've all been replaced by posh restaurants that no normal people from Gloucester can afford to eat at. The bars were all filled with fishermen and other rough-looking guys always ready for a scrap. Lots of fishermen from other places would dock at Gloucester and sell their fish, and while they were waiting, they'd go to one of the local watering holes. A lot of fights would break out against locals and out-of-town fishermen. There used to be a lot of rooming houses as well in the city, where fishermen or vagabonds could rent a room for a couple nights or a month if they wanted to. This transient population also helped fuel Gloucester's growing narcotics scene. And fishermen returned to port from a trip, coming back into Gloucester to celebrate was a big part of old Gloucester's culture back in the day. A lot of kids in Gloucester who grew up in the 60s and early 70s witnessed the transition of the city from a thriving fishing port to H Central. These are the kids that would go on to become, in the late 70s and throughout the 80s, criminals, bank robbers, and eventually most of them convicts, unfortunately. Many of these guys grew up under tough circumstances where they were surrounded by a lot of negativity in their early environments. George Skippy Cream was no exception to this rule. While most of the actual city of Gloucester was rough during this period, Skippy grew up in arguably the toughest neighborhood, Riverdale Park. Riverdale Park, or RDPK as it was tagged everywhere when I was a kid, is the larger of the two public housing projects in the city of Gloucester. Maplewood Park is the smaller of the two and is in the middle of the worst neighborhood in Gloucester, but Riverdale Park on the other hand is over in a nice middle-class neighborhood. Regardless of the neighborhood that surrounded it, Riverdale Park itself was a tough place to grow up. This is where people chime in on the comments and say, "Really? Projects in Gloucester?" Well, it's not Heath Street or Lenox. There are projects in every city, including Gloucester. Back in those days, the park was pretty much a lawless place. My buddy who I used to work with at a local cold storage facility grew up there in the 70s, and I guess the Gloucester Housing Authority was supposed to have their own security personnel. The Gloucester cops refused to go in there, and the Housing Authority police didn't do anything. He also told me that they wouldn't do anything to the units until the tenants moved out. They wouldn't fix broken things, and one lady in the park kept throwing her trash down the basement until it was overflowing out of the bulkhead out into the backyard, and rats were swarming all over it, but they wouldn't do anything until the tenant moved out. It's crazy. Skippy was a tough kid in a tough neighborhood. From a young age, he seemed to stand out amongst his peers for his heart and his fearlessness. Even as a full-grown man, he was never really a big imposing person, only being 5'9" and around 165 pounds, but he was tough as nails. This was the mentality back in the day where guys were really consumed with being the toughest or who was the toughest. I remember even when I was a kid, people were always arguing about who was the toughest in the grade, the school, or even the town. So many kids fought after school for no other reason than who's the toughest one. It's kind of funny now, but everybody took it so serious then. Gloucester kids grew up hearing tales about guys like Howard Blackburn, who survived getting lost at sea by freezing his hands to the oars of his rowboat and rowing to shore. He then came back to Gloucester after losing all his fingers and served drinks at his tavern, telling the patrons of his tales. Amusingly enough, Skippy's first encounter came with the law because he was throwing snowballs at cars and grabbing onto their back bumpers and sliding down the snowy streets of Gloucester. This was back when it actually used to snow in the winter. Very early on, an adversarial relationship developed between Skippy and the Gloucester police. When Skippy was a young teenager, the Gloucester police arrested him and brought him to a juvenile detention center in Jamaica Plains, Boston. Somehow, during his processing and intake, Skippy managed to escape the facility, steal a vehicle nearby, and as legend states it, made it back to Gloucester before the police did. Obviously, when the GPD found out about this, they were not happy to say the least, and Skippy became a target. I just have to say it's kind of amazing to me how personal it became back then between certain police and these guys. It didn't seem like it had anything to do with the job anymore, it was just a personal vendetta. It's just weird because nowadays the cops in Gloucester are just doing their job. They treat people a lot differently now. They actually have a community impact unit, and if you want help, they'll find you a bed that day. Much different than how it used to be in the city. Back in the day, a lot of police treated users very inhumanely. Almost all the cops from that period have retired, and even some have passed away. Now, Skippy's antics or disdain for authority didn't stop at running away from a juvenile detention center. At the very young age of 16, Skippy was sent to the now closed Salem jail. The old jail, like the Charlestown prison, resembled a medieval-style dungeon with a bucket in your cell to use as a toilet. Skippy at 16 was around much older and dangerous men, but was unfazed. He still didn't want to be there, though. When he was on the yard, Skippy scaled the wall, threw a blanket or some sort of fabric over the barbed wire, and jumped the fence. Unfortunately for Skippy, he was apprehended soon after, and this time to ensure his incarceration, they brought him to a more secure Concord State Prison for 6 months at only 16. While in Concord, Skippy began to take up boxing. Growing up in the park, constantly getting into street fights, he was tough and he showed promise with his natural ability and athletic prowess. He began to rehabilitate himself through boxing, and for a time he tried to get away from the streets. Skippy really focused on boxing when he got out. He also began a family with his partner Cheryl when they had a baby girl. Feeling the instinct to be responsible that most men have when starting a family, Skippy focused on boxing and tried to shake the criminal mentality. He trained and worked on his technique, trying to shake his street fighting style and become more polished. After working hard, he became a solid boxer with an incredible jab. Cheryl says he used to take a pair of boots that he ran in and would duct tape them around his ankles and run up and down Centennial Ave and Commonwealth Ave, which are two of the steepest hills in the city, before a fight to prepare. Skippy had success early on in his career, even winning the Golden Gloves tournament in 1976. Although I can't find any record of it, Cheryl says that Skippy fought champion Marvelous Marvin Hagler from Brockton, obviously not in a title bout, maybe it was an unofficial match or something, but Skippy lost by decision. She claims Skippy then fought Hagler's half-brother Robbie Sims and won. Hagler was apparently in Sims' corner during the fight and was very impressed with Skippy's boxing ability. Skippy would go on to start a boxing gym over at the Browns Mall in downtown Gloucester on Main Street. I always thought the Browns Mall and next door Empire Clothing was such grand old buildings when my Nana and Aunt Phyllis would bring me there as a kid. Skippy did this as a charitable gesture to help the kids of Gloucester stay off the street. He saw the positive effect that boxing had on his life as a youngster, and he wanted to do the same for many of the city's youth who were wandering down the same dead-end road. Apparently, Skippy's soft spot for kids didn't end there. Legend has it that on one Christmas, Skippy broke into a toy store up the line, and if you're not from Gloucester, that means 128, and stole as many toys as he could fit into his vehicle. I guess Skippy had a tool that could knock out the alarm systems for an entire block. This shows that even while boxing, Skippy never completely separated himself from the street life or the criminal mentality. But as the legend goes, he then put on a Santa hat and drove around Riverdale Park, leaving toys on kids' doorsteps, ringing the doorbell, and then moving on to the next place. He knew a lot of these kids were going to have crappy Christmases or none at all. Most of their moms were too busy down drinking at Mal's to spend time with them, or had spent all their Christmas money on booze or worse. Skippy knew what it was like growing up in the park and had a tough upbringing. Even though he was a tough guy, he had a real soft spot for kids. On another occasion, he saw a local kid sitting on a wall during a snowstorm, waiting for his mother. He knew the kid's mom was all strung out, was neglecting him, so he took him home. Him and Cheryl took care of the kid like he was their own, raising him with their daughter. The kid's mother showed up in the middle of the night, randomly wrecked, and was asking for her kid back. Skippy told her to beat it and not come back, to which she complied. Eventually, though, social services came and took the child away and placed him with a blood relative. It was very traumatic for everyone as he became part of the family. Even though Skippy had a big heart and did acts of kindness for children, he was no saint. In fact, he had the potential to be a very dangerous person. It seems that throughout his boxing career, Skippy never really broke ties with the criminal underworld or his friends that were involved. In the late 1970s, Skippy began increasingly get involved in pulling off scores, whether they were bank robberies, apothecaries. There's an old school term for you. YouTube is so bizarre about that stuff, that's why I usually just say CVS or Walgreens. But back then, it was mostly local apothecaries. Him and his peers also did house burglaries where they could score jewelry, bonds, cash, whatever they could get their hands on that had some value. This was a growing subculture in the city during this time period, just like it was in places like Charlestown, obviously to a much smaller scale. It just seems like this lifestyle was very appealing to teenagers and guys in their 20s during this era. The outlaws or the bandits that lived outside the laws of society, pulling off scores and evading authorities. A lot of this activity was part of the growing narcotics scene in Gloucester as well. Many of the guys involved in this lifestyle were users or became users, especially as the 80s went on. In turn, many of these jobs were driven by the guys' personal use. But that was not the case for Skippy. Skippy must have just enjoyed the thrill of pulling off a job or living outside the law. There are plenty of guys who don't use but are just addicted to the lifestyle. Plenty of bank robbers say it's a crazy rush doing a job. Skippy was a natural leader, and many of his peers and the younger guys looked up to him. As much as he was loved, Skippy was also feared. When I worked with older guys, they would talk about Skippy, they'd get a look on their face and almost lower their voice, and that was over a decade after he died. Some, unfortunately for Skippy, hated him as well, and this was mostly some people in the Gloucester Police Department. It got to the point where it was almost like two crews against each other instead of the traditional cops and robbers. One of Skippy's close friends got onto the bad side of some people on the force, and apparently some people saw from their window on Willow Street Skippy's friend in handcuffs getting maced and beaten by several officers. Apparently this didn't deter his friend or others in the group as they continued to provoke the police and show disdain for them. A short time later, Skippy's friend's body washed up near the Cape Ann Marina on the Asquam River. The body had been mostly eaten by fish and crabs, but there was a distinguishable tattoo on his body that you could still see, and that's how he was identified. They ruled at autopsy that the death was accidental, but Skippy and his friends thought it was a much more sinister reason. They believed a couple cops who they were feuding with brought their friend either to the train tracks near the train bridge or on Whittemore Street, which used to have industrial buildings down towards the river. Now, of course, they've built condos down there, but they believe the cops brought him down there, unalived him, and dumped him in the river. And then he floated across the river to the nearby marina. It's pretty crazy. That's the stuff you see in movies that happen in huge cities like New York in the 1970s, not a tiny city like Gloucester. Also, I dig clams right around the corner all the time. But Skippy believed so strongly in what happened that he targeted the cop who would go on to become one of the most infamous narcotics detectives in the city for being the culprit, or one of the culprits. Allegedly, Skippy waited in the nearby woods and watched as the officer's wife and children left and made sure no one was in the house before he burnt it to the ground. Okay, I need to be incredibly clear about this. So when I'm talking about this kind of stuff, this is purely like urban legend, like folk tales that have been passed down from generation in Gloucester. I've heard at least 10 different people who are responsible for burning that police officer's house down. So this is just kind of, I don't know, part of like the tale of Skippy. I'm not trying to say that any of this stuff actually really happened. I don't really know. There's nothing you can find on the internet really about any of this stuff. I'm trying to get access to the archives of Gloucester Daily Times, and even that stuff in the newspaper isn't actually really accurate. There's been just, this stuff happened like 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago, some of it. So it's just been passed down through generation and generation in Gloucester. These tales like change over time. So I just need to put that out there. I'm not saying that anybody really did this stuff. I'm not saying that this officer actually killed anybody or that Skippy really burnt his house down. It's just kind of, this stuff is like urban lore in the city of Gloucester. So I just want to be very, very clear about that before people start getting like really angry about some of the stuff I'm saying, okay? Please. The hatred of Skippy by the authorities didn't stop there. When he was arrested for a home robbery in Gloucester, the authorities thought for sure they had him and he would be convicted and sent to prison. In a surprise move that usually always backfires on the defendant, Skippy decided to represent himself. The mostly uneducated kid from the park had a high IQ and natural intelligence. He ended up proving his innocence beyond a reasonable doubt and walked away scot-free, much to the disdain of the Essex County District Attorney's Office and more importantly the Gloucester Police. The police were livid that Skippy was back out on the streets and had beaten the rap. They weren't about to let him live comfortably now, the heat was on. Even with the presence of the authorities, Skippy and his crew kept making scores. A guy told me that Skippy lowered one of the guys in the crew down a deposit chute to gain entrance into a bank. The guy was tall and skinny, so Skippy held him by his ankles and lowered him down. Things kind of culminated between Skippy and the GPD in 1980 when they raided his Smith Street apartment. It was a bit of a tense standoff before the police entered. Skippy apparently threatened if they came in he was going to take their heads off. Some of the police hated Skippy, but they were also kind of afraid of him, and they didn't take threats like that lightly. Eventually, they secured Skippy and the others inside, which consisted of a peer, but also his wife and young daughter. When the police got inside, they trashed the place, destroying their belongings, even cutting apart his daughter's stuffed animals, possibly revenge for destroying the cop's house. The police really didn't find too much. The most incriminating stuff were a couple atlases and maps where Skippy or someone had highlighted routes to and from scores. They also found the layout or floor plans of a bank and a local apothecary. That obviously signaled to police that Skippy and his friends were casing the places out, but not really having anything to hold Skippy on, he was released. Soon after this happened, Skippy and Cheryl moved down to Florida with another couple. Skippy again was trying to distance himself from that scene and get away from the cops that hated him. He could see how this lifestyle was affecting his family. His daughter, who was just a little girl when they raided Smith Street, was deeply affected by it and it troubled her throughout her life. Things were going well for them. They opened up a small little diner type place and Cheryl became pregnant and had their second child. Soon after they moved down there though, some of Skippy's compatriots back in Gloucester robbed the First National Bank of Ipswich in the Magnolia section of the city, which is way out next to Manchester. The robbers made off with over 70 grand, not a bad take for 1981. They fled on foot into the Magnolia woods. Authorities followed their footprints through the snow for 5 miles through the West Gloucester forest until they got to the train bridge where the culprits crossed in order to make it back into the city of Gloucester. The local authorities had suspects from the beginning. The cops in Gloucester knew what guys in the city were doing jobs like this. Because of the amount of money in the bank being protected by the FDIC, the FBI became involved and the heat was now definitely on. Feeling the heat, a couple guys involved hopped on a plane and came down to Florida to stay with Skippy. Whether or not he was aware of what was really going on or if he told them they could come down, when they showed up at his place in Florida and told him that they had heat because of the Magnolia job, Skippy was livid. He knew this was going to bring heat on him and his family during their fresh start. But unknowingly to him, the authorities were already trying to tie Skippy into the crime as an unindicted co-conspirator for the maps they found at his house during the Smith Street raid. Apparently there were notes and highlighted escape routes to the bank there. Either way, it didn't really matter. After his friends came down and stayed with him, the feds already planned to use this against him and charge him with harboring fugitives. The feds ended up taking Skippy and the others into custody and questioned Cheryl, tracking her down to a friend's house while their kids were playing. It was really embarrassing for her. The two ended up losing everything. They started down to Florida and had to come back up to Massachusetts to deal with this case. It was heartbreaking for Skippy and Cheryl. They saw their dream for a better and different life dashed right before their very eyes. Apparently, they came back to Massachusetts. Skippy saw one of the people responsible at a party in Dogtown and beat him severely. People were trying to pull him off, and he was yelling, "You ruined our life!" When they came back to Massachusetts, they moved to the city of Everett, which is right across the Mystic River from Boston. Skippy figured that the cops in Everett didn't know him, and hopefully they would leave him alone. It was way too hot in Gloucester for him. Then in September of 1982, a Gloucester man was clipped in Melrose, either in a deal gone bad or a robbery that went sideways. The Gloucester man survived, and when police arrived, they said there was over $200,000 worth of H at the location. That's probably a gross overestimation. The authorities arrested the person responsible, but said they believed another man was at the scene as well. Since Skippy was living in nearby Everett and the victim was from Gloucester, the authorities were beginning to believe that somehow Skippy was involved. People say it's a possibility that maybe Skippy dropped him off at the scene, but other than that, he wasn't really involved. Either way, the authorities were onto him at this point. Right after the crime, Skippy and Cheryl's brother Pudgy drove to Gloucester in Pudgy's blue Mustang. The newspaper says that Cream's brother said they were coming to Gloucester to talk to the brother of the man who was wounded at the crime scene about the incident, while Cheryl claims they were bringing fish to a relative in Gloucester. So I really don't know. Regardless of why they were there, when they came to the city, they were quickly spotted by two patrolmen who then followed them. They were driving on Friend Street in Gloucester's Portuguese Hill neighborhood when the two officers spotted them and gave pursuit. Why did the police originally pursue Skippy and Pudgy? Did they want to question them about the Melrose incident? The chief said after the fact that Skippy had an active bench warrant. But did he really? This is one of the many questions that surround the incident. Why did they even chase him in the first place? Were they simply targeting Skippy because they didn't like him? Once Pudgy saw the cops were following them, he sped up down the tightly packed Friend Street and turned up Webster Street past the Gloucester Fraternity Club, and then turned onto the dead-end Sadler Street extension before ditching the car and fleeing on foot. That's another question I have. Why instead of pulling over did they ditch the car and run? Was Skippy worried about what just happened in Melrose? Did he know they had a warrant for him? Or did he just think the cops were going to do something bad? Pudgy told his sister they ran because they had no bail money. They ditched the car right next to my old apartment on the corner of Webster and Sadler Streets, ran through a small bit of woods at the dead end, and then scaled down the embankment onto the Route 128 extension between the second rotary and the stoplights. The two officers hopped right out of their vehicle and gave chase. Pudgy and Cream ran across both lanes of traffic onto the other side of the extension, probably thinking if they could make it to the rotary, they could escape towards the reservoir and then into Dogtown. Pudgy, which his sister described as a jackrabbit, was way out ahead of everyone. Skippy was further back, close to the police. Pudgy said he heard a single blast and stopped short in his tracks. He looked back and saw that Skippy had fallen. He ran back towards Cream and tried to help him as the cops told him to freeze. This is where the story gets really murky and why the legend endures. What really happened? The patrolman who unalived Cream claimed that Skippy turned and fired at him before he returned fire. But where was Skippy's weapon? And Pudgy swears he only heard one blast. It wasn't until minutes later when the sergeant arrived that he personally found a weapon near Cream. The two patrolmen who were on the scene oddly couldn't find it, but moments after arriving, the sergeant does. The patrolman who fired at Cream was visibly shaken up, not being able to keep his composure at the scene. Skippy was brought to nearby Aston Gilbert Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Cheryl was absolutely devastated. She had a 9-year-old daughter and their new 9-month-old son. Now their father and the love of her life was gone. She was sad, but more than anything, she was furious. When the authorities told her what happened, she went ballistic, yelling at them, and this anger carried on throughout the entire process. She felt that everyone was lying to her and everyone was afraid to tell the truth. Her brother Pudgy went through the ringer. He insisted he only heard one blast and that Skippy had no peace on him, that there was none in the car. The authorities harassed him and made his life miserable because he refused to go along with their version of the story. Not to mention that he loved Skippy like a type of father figure. Cheryl was much older than him and they had more of a mother-son relationship than a brother-sister one, so Skippy was like a father to him and also his hero. After Skippy's death, he had kind of a psychological break and would walk around town carrying a framed picture of Skippy. Cheryl said he even started to dress like Skippy and talk like him, which was creeping out family members. Cheryl and Skippy's mother wanted justice. Even the DA say found it incredibly strange that neither one of the police on the scene recovered Skippy's alleged weapon, but a sergeant who arrived minutes later found it. He thought it was very suspect. Cheryl and Skippy's mom thought they would receive justice, but eventually the officer would be found to have acted in self-defense and would not face prison time for Skippy's death. The family was devastated, but they weren't going to give up and filed a wrongful death suit against the officers in the Gloucester Police Department and the city of Gloucester. The outpouring of support for Skippy's wife and family after his death was incredible. Cheryl's father, who initially didn't really like Skippy but ended up loving the man later, paid for his funeral and it drew an enormous crowd. The huge Portuguese church, Our Lady of Good Voyage, had people out on the street because it was filled to capacity. Even though Skippy had an Irish or English last name, he was mostly Portuguese. Italians and Portuguese were the two biggest groups in the city in the 20th century. St. Anne's was the Italian Catholic Church, and Our Lady of Good Voyage was the Portuguese one. Apparently, after hearing about his tragic passing, Marvin Hagler contacted Cheryl and asked if there was anything he could do. Cheryl said Skippy thought the world of him, and would he be one of the pallbearers and help carry the casket, to which he replied, "It would be my honor." I guess it was quite a scene. At that point, there was really no black people in Gloucester, and there you had one of the greatest boxers of the generation carrying Skippy's casket. People who felt for Skippy's family gave them money to hire a big-time lawyer to represent the family in the wrongful death suit. They were asking for $6 million from the actual cops, the department, and the city, which Cheryl says were all complicit. She also said she didn't really care about the money. She just wanted the truth and some sort of justice. She told Skippy's mother she could keep all the money. The case was going really well for them, but then something happened and their attorney crapped out on them. Cheryl thinks he either got paid off or someone put pressure on him, but either way, he kind of blew the case, she said. She was devastated. She never really recovered from the pain of losing her loved one and the father of her children. During the wrongful death suit, they were able to hire a professional ballistics expert. He claimed that there was no way Skippy was turned and firing at the officer when he was hit. His back was fully turned, most likely with his hands raised in the air. The expert also examined the weapon that Cream allegedly had. By the way, there was also no powder residue on Cream's hands. But the weapon was an old piece of junk that wasn't even functioning. Rumor has it that the weapon had been reported stolen from the police station over a decade before. His conclusion was that Skippy was hit directly in the back while facing the opposite direction, and the weapon was strictly a throwdown to be staged next to a potential perp. But it didn't really matter because the case was lost. Things didn't go well for the officer who was responsible after the fact. Even though he didn't go to prison for taking out Skippy, his life just kind of fell apart afterwards. He received death threats on a constant basis. People would call his house at all hours of the night and scare his wife. Eventually it became too much for her and she left him. One of the craziest stories I've heard about the threats made to the officer was one night while he sat drinking at a local bar. One of Skippy's mental friends was tipped off and allegedly entered the bar with an actual human skull that he dug up from a grave and placed it on the bar in front of the cop, looked him in the eye and said, "This is gonna be you," before walking out as the cop turned white as a ghost. Who knows if it's really true, but man, what a tale. Either way, the cop had what many referred to as a mental breakdown in the years that followed Skippy's death, showing that he did not get off scot-free. As the 1980s progressed, the scene in Gloucester just got worse. Many addicts from small towns nearby ended up in downtown Gloucester, close to the supply. The bank and store robbery crews got more brazen and violent, with many of them going away to state and federal prison. The majority of these guys were using, and their habits just kept getting worse and worse. By the late 1980s and early 90s, Gloucester, along with Fall River, had some of the highest per capita HIV cases in North America. You couldn't go to Walgreens and show your ID and buy gear or works back then, so everyone shared them and they spread diseases like this. It was a real stigma when I was growing up. That's another thing. I grew up with some of the kids whose parents were involved in this stuff, and you could really see over the years the effect it had on them. Many of them unfortunately followed them into a path of a life of active addiction or criminal acts that landed them in prison. It was strange. As an adolescent, I could see some of the older cops having disdain for the kids just like they did their parents. The cop who was responsible for taking Skippy's life actually got into a physical altercation with his son at a party when I was in high school, outside of Swinson's Field in East Gloucester. It was kind of surreal that it actually happened. But like I said, nowadays the Gloucester police have a much different approach. I've experienced both sides of it personally. But the wild old days of the 1970s and 80s have passed. There aren't any bank crews anymore, and bodies rarely end up in the woods or on the river. The wide open waterfront is a completely different place as well. They definitely cleaned up the city, which is nice, but the way they're gentrifying Gloucester is wrong. They're forcing all the working and middle class people out with overpriced rents and houses. The Skippy Cream legend is a vivid look back into the wild old days of Gloucester's past when the city was a much different, seedier place. Ultimately, the story is a tragedy. A young 27-year-old man died, leaving his young daughter and a son that would grow up never knowing his father. Some people believe it was simply karma, a violent man who died in a violent way, but the ripples of Skippy's death could be felt for decades to come. Pudgy Cheryl's brother had some sort of mental breakdown and tried to self-medicate himself. Eventually, he ended up falling into a coma some years back and now resides in a rest home. Cheryl herself never recovered from Skippy's death, lost a young baby a few years later that she had with a new partner. She couldn't deal with all the pain and began to self-medicate as well. The poor woman has suffered over the years. Skippy's kids also felt a huge void in their life with their father gone, plus his daughter was old enough to remember many of the traumatic events that happened. Many of the guys that ran with Skippy either end up becoming addicts or going to prison for long periods of time, and their families as well suffered. Many have now passed on as well, and some are forever changed because of their experiences. The officer who took Skippy's life seems to have had his peace forever taken from him, so everyone kind of lost. That's why I say it's a tragedy. Skippy's legend carries on. He has affected people who've never even met him. Cheryl's son from her new partner, who's my buddy, Chris Danju, whose shout out actually found the old newspaper clippings and asked me to do this story. I've always looked for info about Skippy, and there's nothing out there about him on the internet, and there's actually very little about this time period in general. I couldn't read some of it, but it was an incredible find. Chris followed in Skippy's footsteps getting into boxing. He was always intrigued growing up listening to tales of Skippy Cream, just like myself and many other Cape Ann youth of the 1980s and 90s. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know some of it was probably a little heavy. Maybe some people didn't like me talking about some of this stuff. But it's history, and the city's changing so fast. In the next 10 years, it's going to be completely different, and all this stuff's going to disappear. So that's the big reason why I'm documenting a lot of stuff in this channel, because if I don't, I feel like in the next few decades, it's all going to be gone. No one's going to remember this stuff. Everything's changing so fast with gentrification. So I know a lot of people aren't too happy about a lot of stuff I talk about, but I don't know. I'm just going to do it the best I can and be respectful and just try to tell these stories in the right way. And a lot of you people are enjoying it. The channel's growing. Thank you guys for all the support. I'd like to thank Cheryl, Skippy's former partner, for helping me fill in holes of the story that I couldn't have otherwise because there's nothing about it on the internet. I'd like to thank her son, Chris Danju, who's my friend, for helping me get those newspaper clippings. Even though I couldn't really read all of them, it was a huge help. I would have never been able to get this video done without them. So thank you guys. Shout out to everybody in the city of Gloucester, and prayers and wishes to Skippy's family, to his children, to anybody that was touched by this story. If you guys liked it, you know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Most of all, guys, the most important thing, make good choices, make good decisions, take good care of yourselves, your friends, your family, your fellow human beings. Try to have a nice day. I'll talk to you guys real soon. God bless.